We're in portion of TopVelocity.net, 3x biometric analysis here of Cole Litzman. Take him out of leg lift. Okay, you can see at this point, when you see a real vertical shin and the lift leg is down and about to move in front of the hip, that there's not a lot of momentum going forward. We really need to start to build our momentum out of leg lift. It's a falling movement. We're moving forward and down at the same rate. And the drive shin, we do want to hold external rotation in the back leg, but we want the shin to move with the front hip. So there's just not enough momentum at this point, what's going to happen is the timing's now going to be off. So the lift leg starts to open with Cole and the back leg is still vertical. Now he's not in a position to drive because that shin is too vertical. So now he's going to have to start initiating some of a push. It's just not going to be linear enough to really power hip rotation. So you can see about at this point here, the front foot's very open. This would be a better position of the shin to drive, but because the moment he started moving, he wasn't in a linear position, it just continues to just be rotational. So this is a very rotational lower half. You can see that the front leg moves out, the back leg moves down, okay, into landing. So the problem if we're that rotational in the back leg, more just external to internal rotation of the drive femur, when we hit front foot, we're not going to have a lot of momentum, which you can see he's not far off the rubber. His foot's still on the rubber, and you're not going to have a lot of power behind the back hip because the front leg is landing closed, which you can see Cole doing well here. So the trunk, as the hips open, the trunk can carry forward. The back leg needs to power the hips because the front leg cannot power it because it has to stay closed. So if you look at the kinematic sequence here, here's front foot, right at this long line here, this straight line. The dotted line, the first dotted line is maximum external rotation and ball release. But you see it front foot here, the pelvis rotation is slower than the torso rotation. This is the point where you'd want the pelvis rotation ahead of the torso rotation, even close to peaking. And we can see the torso or the pelvis rotation continues to peak. Let's see where it hits its peak. Okay, so it hits peak probably right here. So a little late to peak, and you can see the red line on the image of the pelvis, and that's indicating it's moving into its peak. But at the same time too, you can see the red line on the torso also peaking. So there's not much of a separation in the time of peaking, which is critical for sequencing the kinetic chain effectively. We call it hip to shoulder separation. So at front foot strike, and not enough power, driving peak hip rotation. Therefore, the trunk moves ahead because that's what the trunk does. The glove will tuck, the trunk will shift forward early to overcompensate, to try to pick up that loss of energy coming up the kinetic chain. So we see the torso rotation peaking somewhere about right here, just before maximum external rotation. But if we go back to landing, the torso rotation was 575, and we go to its peak, and it only looks, about 200 degrees per second faster. Not much of a jump there, and that's another reason why we want the pelvis significantly peaking ahead of the trunk, because it's like it winds the top. Therefore, it'll release more energy, will grow more energy, it'll launch more energy forward. So we're not seeing that growth of energy, and that's because the pelvis failed to power rotation through the lower half. And also too, like you said, because when you don't have that, the trunk overcompensates by tucking early or shifting forward early. So we can see the trunk here. If we go to the trunk angles and the forward trunk flexion, we can see here at foot plant, the forward trunk flexion is -7 where it's back, but quickly after plant, it's all the way out to, it says -5. I would say because that's the relationship of the torso to the pelvis, but you can see the pelvis abducting or anterior tilting forward. You see the trunk in really hard full extension. So it's really where the pelvis is pushing the trunk at this point. You can see after landing, quickly the pelvis pushes the trunk forward. Even the trunk can extend back, and you have a lot of trunk extension. And then maximum external rotation here, you're at 5 degrees. So an elite pitcher would be somewhere around 40 degrees at this point. But we do see that early shift of the pelvis, pushing everything forward a little too early. And we know it's too early because the arm is now behind. So when we're opening the trunk here, getting the maximum external rotation, when you see that elbow behind the back, that's arm drag, what we call hyperangulation. So that typically happens when you have a quick shift of weight forward. When we see that pelvis quickly tipping anterior, tilting forward, you see the chest pushing out even though the trunk extends really well back. But that is an early transfer, and we know it's early because the arm is behind the back. We could say the arm is late, but the thing is you can see it pretty much front foot plant here. The arm is almost in full external rotation. So you could try to cock the arm up earlier, but that's only going to force the trunk to launch earlier, which when you launch the trunk earlier, it doesn't receive as much energy from the lower half. You got to think of the whip. The later the end goes, the more energy we can push up if we're able to put a lot of energy into it. So even though the trunk starts to shift forward, you can see at maximum external rotation where that energy is ready to transfer to the arm, there's a lot more forward flexion left in the trunk. So we go all the way out here. Now here's pitch release, and the forward flexion is still going up. We're at 35 now. And then all the way out here, after pitch release, we're already at 65. We want to get to that maximum forward flexion definitely before ball release, because that's energy we're leaving in our body that we're not transferring. So, you know, it really goes back to the beginning of the movement and not keeping the momentum peaking early. So the momentum was late. So at landing, the hips are late. Now the trunk goes early. Now the arm gets caught behind. Now the arm has to pull through from a lot of horizontal abduction or scap loading to adduction in front of the face. So you're actually putting a lot of stress on the arm to catch up as opposed to the trunk. You really want the trunk being because it's the big, thick part of the body doing most of the catch up. You want the arm syncing with the trunk, working with the trunk to funnel energy, but you want the bigger catch up in the trunk, and that's what we talk about hip to shoulder separation. And that's not going to happen until we come out of leg lift well, we get forward and down the same rate, we get linear before we open our front foot, and then we get a good drive out of the back leg. So when we land, we've got peak hip rotation, the hips open, trunk still closed. And when we do that, the trunk's going to want to stay closed longer because it's going to feel all of that energy wanting to throw the trunk forward, and then the arm is just going to funnel for there, and that's going to be way more velocity and way healthier for the arm.